Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Those of you in the room here and the 20 plus that are online. My name is Ian Gadd. I am the chair of the board here at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. So on behalf of BRLSI, welcome. I'm also one half of the convener group that puts together the Literature and Humanities programme. Betty Sushar is my partner in crime on this. But I'm also, and this will lead us on to our speaker tonight, a professor at Bath Spa University. And it's a delight always to be able to welcome a colleague from Bath Spa to speak here at BRLSI. Celia is in the creative writing department, which in some universities, the English departments and the creative writing departments do not get on. But I can say that one of the joys of being at Bath Spa is actually English and creative writing are work very closely together in lots of ways, and not least in the fact that Celia was persuadable to come and give this talk this evening. So just to introduce Celia, Dr Celia Brayfield. She is a New York Times and Sunday Times best-selling writer whose fiction ranges from multi-generational epics to contemporary social novels. She has also, as you must be aware for tonight's talk, written non-fiction books as well, 7 of them, including cultural commentary, travel writing, and most recently literary biographies, which brings us to tonight's topic, Writing Black Beauty, Anna Sewell and the Story of Animal Rights, which was published by the History Press in 2023. But enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to our speaker, Celia, who will speak on Black Beauty in Bath, which wins the prize for alliteration, how Bath inspired Anna Sewell's bestseller. Celia.
My first career was as a journalist, so I'm always guilty of alliteration. This lecture really grew out of my last book. Here it is. And even as I began writing this book, some of Anna Sewell's letters came to auction in Bath, which alerted me to the fact that she had lived here. She was actually born and died and was most connected personally to East Anglia, to the Norwich region. But she did live, the slide has advanced. This is exciting. She did live in the Bath area, and she lived here at the absolutely, can we stop the slides doing this? What is going on? Get back. Yes. There shouldn't be a timer on it. Let's see if we can get away with it. So it was a key period because it was the experiences she had here that most directly appear in her book in several different ways. So why did I get interested in this book in the first place? Well, of course, I was a pony-mad little girl, and I wasn't allowed to have riding lessons or to read Black Beauty because my parents were terrified that I would get into posh, expensive interests. So a quick tip that you might care to pass on to any new parents of your acquaintance: if you want to get somebody really keen, if you want your children to be keen on something, ban it. So I was, Black Beauty was kind of mythologically exciting to me when I was a pony-mad little girl. But what made me actually want to write a book about it? Now, although we get on tremendously well with the English department at Bath Spa, there are other English academics who I have encountered over the years who take the view that popular fiction is rubbish and that literary fiction is the only thing that matters. This annoys me because I have written a lot of popular fiction, and I had been cherishing for years the idea of an academic book called Bad Books That Changed the World, because it is in fact popular fiction that really advances public debate. I would not have begun with Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is credited with having created the cultural landscape for the American Civil War, simply because it's such a contentious book. But the next book I would have looked at would have been Black Beauty, because it was an enormously popular novel. It led to changes in the laws all over the world. It completely rescued the RSPCA, who were struggling a bit, of which perhaps more later. It's also got a place in literature in that it is the first properly anthropomorphic novel. You get anthropomorphic novels in which the characters are animals, such as, for example, Animal Farm, in which the characters have human characteristics. But there are very, very few anthropomorphic novels in which the animal has their own characteristics. And then when I started to look at the story of how Black Beauty was written, I thought, well, first of all, I discovered that Anna Sewell was disabled. She was running home from school in London when she was possibly 12 or 14. She slipped on some wet leaves. She broke her ankle. And of course, in days before X-rays, exactly what she did, we will never know. But the break never healed. Most of her life, she couldn't walk. She was often in pain. And after this accident, she had a very miserable time. Her family were Quakers. She lost faith. Both she and her mother lost the Christian faith that had kept them, that had sustained them really through quite a tough childhood. She crashed into what we would now recognize as a depression. She possibly also had something similar to glandular fever, because she was seriously ill and people thought she was going to die in her 20s. And then as she grew older, she came to terms with her disability. And she had been a very active farmer's granddaughter, because her mother was a farmer's daughter. She'd been a very active young woman, and she discovered that first of all, she could drive a pony trap when her family were rich enough to keep a pony. And secondly, she could ride side saddle. Because if any riders in, you know, if you're riding side saddle, you actually are only using one leg, and the other one is clamped in hideous iron clamps, stopping you falling off. We hope. So, with this ability she also, because she was often ill, she wasn't very strong, and she started to develop a rapport with her horses and really manage them through the relationship that she developed with them, of which more later. Now, if I do this, nothing happens. If I do that, yes. So, she was in her 40s when her father decided that they were going to take this house, Blue Lodge, I think it's now Blue Lodge Farm, at Abson, which is the actual borough, I think, is Wick and Abson, outside Bath or outside Bristol, depending which way you look at it. Now, Anna's father was by all accounts a sweet man, beloved of his grandchildren. He was not a very good businessman, and his connection to reality, or indeed common sense, was quite tenuous. he loved the idea of doing up a house. He had already done up a house in London where Anna grew up in Dalston in East London. And when he heard of this house, he thought, this is marvellous. We will move to the country and do up a house. It was 2 hours ride to post a letter. They were a long way from anywhere. And his wife, Mary, who he led a merry dance. I mean, as a young man, he went bankrupt at least once. And the only cross word I ever found that she said about him was in a letter she wrote to a friend saying, "My good husband has decided we are going to move to this place." That was as critical as she got. She was very loyal. Mary really gave her the love of literature to her daughter Anna. There were 2 children, the son, younger son, older daughter Anna. Mary had been a poetry-crazy young woman, reading French novels by candlelight in secret, which, as someone brought up in a Quaker family, was really quite naughty thing to do. And she and Anna both loved reading. They would binge read until 3 in the morning together. And Mary, when Anna was grown up and as she was trying to come to terms with her illness, she spent quite a lot of time in hydrotherapy spas, seeking a cure, which she didn't find, but she did at least find distraction. Mary then had an empty nest and thought she'd write a book, and she was actually tremendously good at it. And by that time, they moved from Brighton, where the Quaker community had found her husband a job as a bank manager. They moved from there, they moved to outside Brighton to somewhere fairly remote again, and she started writing what Thackeray described meanly as low church verse novels. In other words, her novels were written in rhyming poetry. They were extraordinarily ingenious. They were pretty moralistic. But they were also full of the most lovely observations of nature and thumbnail characterizations. They're thoroughly enchanting. And she managed to, one of them, she managed to sell 1 million copies of. And this is in the middle of the 19th century. That's absolutely colossal. So by the time they moved, she was actually a best-selling writer. And she was able to sit down in Blue Lodge and write a lot. And in fact, a lot of what we know of their life there comes from the memoirs of other writers, other mostly women, mostly Christian writers who visited her, because she had a whole network. And Anna, although she at this point had not written anything for herself, Anna was her editor. And Mary said that, not one word of hers was ever published, but that Anna had cast an eye on it in the first place. And there were descriptions of them working together, and they really worked extremely closely. So both in Mary's writing and in Black Beauty, you can ask yourself, is this actually joint authorship? Did they write these things together? Anyway, so there they are. The area is considered outstandingly beautiful and was at the time. This is one of the many lovely landscapes that were painted around there. Jane Austen's characters in Northanger Abbey were always setting off for Wick Rocks for a lovely picnic. Even today, that's the old quarry, which is an award-winning nature reserve. Very inspiring and beautiful place. But one of the one of the specific inspirations in Black Beauty is Black Beauty's first home was Birtwick Park, where he having been bred, was schooled and became a family horse for the squire, who was a good owner. It was the first good owner he had. And the Birtwick Park is thought to have been modelled on Tracy Park. There are other candidates for it, but the description in the book is very, very similar. So, however, it's not all Palladian arches and scenic picnic spots, because Wick was really a mining town. Now, this is a picture of the ochre mines, which hadn't really been built on this scale when Anna Sewell lived here. But coal and iron ore had been mined in this area for centuries. And there were a lot of other associated light industries like paper making in the area, because the river that rushes through that valley was very good for turning mills and also carrying away effluent. Frankly, when you read the descriptions of Wick at this time, it sounds like an absolute hellscape. The population of the village was about 700, and a very high proportion of them were migrant workers who had come looking for work. You know, we are talking about the Industrial Revolution. They were people who had looked for work from all over the agricultural areas in the West Country, but some of them from much further away. There was a church, which was not very useful. There was no school. Imagine a village of 700 people with no school. And there was a high proportion of single men, or men who were without their families. Some men had travelled with their families, but others hadn't. And the extent to which the miners and the factory workers were exploited in the general community was horrible. They were very badly housed, and the animals were particularly maltreated. Shall we take a moment just to remember that every single one of these beautiful golden stones that we love in Bath so much was dragged up here by a horse, or several horses. The iron ore and the coal was taken down to the railhead at Keynsham by horses and carts. And there were 3 pubs in Wick, and one of them wouldn't give the carters water for their horses unless they bought drink. And that meant that drunkenness was a problem. And we're not talking about people coming out of the pub being a bit rowdy at chucking out time. Don't forget that this is before food safety standards, before licensing laws, before any kind of regulation. Most of what they were drinking was not very good for their health, shall we say. And the miners' lives were very, very hard indeed. One of Mary Sewell's associates, who actually worked as a volunteer social worker in London, did record a family where both the husband and the wife were casually employed. And if they did manage to get any work, they came home with the money and they bought porter for them, that's, you know, stout Guinness type stuff, and a tot of gin to keep the baby quiet. So the relationship that people had with alcohol at that time is not what it is today, and it's important to understand that. So, Victorian mining, by candlelight, by hand, becoming mechanized, definitely using pit ponies. Mary Sewell, being a good Quaker woman, had worked all her life as a volunteer social worker. Even when she was, a very young wife with tiny babies, she would take food to the poor families in her neighborhood. She would volunteer to write letters for them. She would visit people in prison. She would read to people in the workhouse. Quaker meetings always began with inquiries at this time, and the inquiries would be questions like, have we done enough to look after the poor people in our neighborhood? And Mary, even though she left the Quaker movement, and Anna too, took this very seriously. So the first thing they did in this place where there was no school was they opened a library, and very quickly realized that there were not that many people who were sufficiently literate to actually benefit from it. So they opened a school. Now, at this time, there was no free education other than that provided perhaps by religious bodies, faith schools, as they're called now. While Anna was living with her mother and father in Wick, an Act of Parliament was passed to raise the age at which children could be employed from 10 to 12. So you can see that with both parents working long hours and child labour being possible from the age of 12, nobody was really getting a great education. And Anna had always taught at a Sunday school, but we shouldn't think of this as a Sunday school where you go to learn Bible stories and sing little songs. A Sunday school was basically the only kind of education that a great many poor people got. Anna taught literacy, numeracy, reading, writing, arithmetic, and she also taught natural history. So this is a page from one of Mary's books. She was basically walking in the same area as Dickens, but with a different audience in mind. And she wasn't the only writer in her family. So around Anna was Mary, her mother, who at this time, she was not only very much in demand for her books, but she was in demand for her essays as well. Anne Wright, who was Anna's aunt, actually taught natural history. When I looked at her position in Victorian society, she was kind of a David Attenborough figure. She popularized natural history. And her books were so popular that Queen Victoria bought them for her children. But Anne Wright taught at oh goodness, how could anyone think I could go so fast? Anne Wright taught at a school called the Red House, which was a reform school. And a reform school meant that children who had been convicted of crimes such as stealing a loaf of bread would be sent to prison unless they could be found a place at a reform school where there was a hope of them being taught a trade and not being taught how to be a career criminal. So the Red House was in fact the Sewell family's enterprise. Her uncle founded it, and later on her brother took it over. And her aunt, Anne Wright, taught there. And Anne was also a real model for Anna, because she was also a woman who did not have good health, but nevertheless would jump in a pony trap and drive herself miles over the countryside to go to work teaching. And this is what Anna was doing while she was living in Blue Lodge, she would either go out and ride or she would take the pony trap. And sometimes she was teaching in the evening. The women who visited her and her mother, recorded her going out in all weathers, no matter how wet, riding in pitch darkness. So she was well acquainted with that. I wouldn't do that. I'd be terrified. Horses have much better night vision than people do, but all the same. And one of the crucial things that happens in Black Beauty is Black Beauty, having had a very good owner, is then sold when that owner goes abroad and is kept by a much less good owner. And this less good owner has a much less good groom who doesn't pick his feet out. He starts to get a bit lame and he gets a loose shoe. And his owner rides him down to the pub, quite a long way away, gets drunk, comes out in the middle of the night, gets on the horse, ignores the fact that he's got a loose shoe, and rides him over a rough road until he falls. Beauty falls, he injures himself, he cuts his knees, which meant that his career as any kind of society horse was over. It was called having broken knees. And his rider is killed. And that episode would clearly have come from those awful rides that Anna was taking down from Blue Lodge to the school, the little cottage they had turned into a school in Wick. Just a word about a couple of other writers in the family. Maria Wright was another aunt, and for her, she didn't become a writer till she was 70, having cared for her invalid brother until then. And she wrote a book called, I fail to recall the title. It's about a Quakeress who rode from the north of England to London to save her grandchildren from the Great Plague. And that book actually also gives you a picture of Anna, an intrepid rider and one who talked to her horse. And the horse was even a black horse with a white star, just like Black Beauty. And another book that Maria Wright wrote gives a picture of Anna as an angelic, very beautiful and very tranquil Sunday school teacher. So if we want to know what she was like, we can look at her aunt's novels and find her living on in those pages. And then the final writer in the family, or in fact the one who was published first, was Sarah Stickney Ellis, who was like a proto-feminist. Queen Victoria coming to the throne and as a monarch throwing her weight around and refusing to have her husband take over was quite an inspiring figure to a lot of English women. And Sarah Stickney Ellis was one of them, and she wrote 4 books, beginning with one called The Women of England, which were called conduct books, but they were about how women ought to live. Now, if you think about this question of how women ought to live hadn't really been on the agenda in previous times. You know, women were too busy having 12 children and churning the butter by hand and generally being good wives. And Sarah Stickney Ellis's books, which were also enormously popular, really started to make women think about what they were doing in the world. She too had been brought up as a Quaker, and she was a very close friend of Anna and her mother's, and they talked to each other, they corresponded a lot, and they visited a lot. So here's a picture of children down a mine. There is very little record of the actual mining community in Wick, so this is not from there, but it does give you an idea of how really tough life was for Anna's pupils. And her mother wrote an essay in which she described the day of a miner, her friend, a neighbour in Wick. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, his wife creeps downstairs and makes him a cup of tea that he made set out warm. She goes to bed again, and away he goes, rain, wind, snow, all the same, plunging into the dark of winter, through the miry roads and over ill-trodden, tenacious field paths, until in the dark or early dawn, he arrives at his post of labour. He is then lowered down into the close atmosphere of the pit and makes his way along the subterranean path to his place of work. And there he lies down, half naked, in some seam of coal, often wet as well, to pick it out, his eyes, nose, and mouth exposed to the coal dust, and his skin covered with it. Here, hour after hour, he lies in his black sepulchre, quarrying out our comfortable fires. The allotted hours of toil finished, he walks his 4 miles home again. He is not a young man, and I have often noticed his weary steps as he ascends the hill to his own house. There he must wash all over to avoid the injurious effect of coal dust on the skin. After a supper of potatoes and a scrap of bacon to relish it, my friend goes early to bed that he may gain sufficient rest for the next day's toil. Now, if that sounds vaguely familiar, you might recall the description of a miner's day in George Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier. You might recall some of the descriptions in D.H. Lawrence of how miners lived in the early 20th century. But Mary was writing this 50 years before. And it's moving that so little had changed. So I'll just say a little bit about how coming from Quaker families and being brought up as Quakers affected their lives. One of the best questions anybody ever asked me was, would Anna Sewell have written Black Beauty if she hadn't been a Quaker? And I suspect not. It was this insistent and persistent injunction to do good. Quaker meetings, and this is a picture of one, were largely silent. They were meditative. There was no ritual. There were no services. And the Quaker movement was very egalitarian. Women were encouraged to speak at meetings just as much as men. And here's a picture. This is actually early 20th century. But there is a woman addressing a Quaker meeting. And it's quite remarkable how Quaker women were prominent, not just in the animal rights movement, but in the welfare movement as a whole. I think we've all heard of Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer. And Anna, growing up and visiting her family in Norwich a lot, would have seen and heard really prominent Quaker women talking about their work. So the idea that she could do something in the world was something that had lived, and she should do something in the world, was something she had absorbed from very early. And she was a very downright person. You know, she was very no-nonsense, and sitting in total silence for 2 hours thinking about God never sat well with her. She was very happy to leave the movement, and although they didn't really settle anywhere, they did end up going to the village Church of England church when they moved back to East Anglia. So perhaps she was always going to lapse. But, you know, Ignatius Loyola was right. They had her till she was 6, and she really lived a Quaker life, even though she wasn't actually a Quaker person. So, they lived in Wick for 6 years. They not only ran the school, but they took up the cause of their impoverished and oppressed neighbours in all kinds of different ways. They did start a temperance movement, offering cocoa and cake instead of hard drink. And, you know, the legacy of the American Prohibition makes us think that do-gooding temperance women were just moralistic and pathetic. But actually, given that the role that drink was playing and the appalling, it was basically poison, the appalling exploitation, adulteration of beer and spirits at that time, I think it possibly deserves a bit more admiration than it usually gets. And they did things like take on the landlords. Mary in particular visited one family where the cottage chimney was falling down and the landlord wouldn't fix it. And this is not just cosmetic. The fire is the only thing they had to keep them warm or to cook on. And she made herself seriously unpopular with the landlords by pursuing grievances like this and getting something done. And when the landlord, in some cases, would not repair the property, she paid for the repairs herself. Eventually, Anna's father never left the Quaker movement, which is very wise on his part, uncharacteristically wise, I would say, because the Quakers really looked after their own. And he got very lonely and miserable living in Blue Lodge, and was persuaded to come out of retirement and manage a bank in Bath. And so the family moved back to Bath for 2 years. And among their papers was a letter from one of the mining community addressed to Anna. Dear lady, I felt I could not let you go off without sending you these few lines. But I feel much contrition in writing to you. My heart is full while I write. I feel like the disciples did when Jesus was going to leave them, and I hope the Lord will still bless us all and bless you wherever you go. When I think how beneficial you have been to the inhabitants of Wick, and how they will all miss you when you are gone away, I hope, dear Miss Sewell, you got home safe. When I met her on the road to Wick, I was so overjoyed I felt like one lifted out of the body. I couldn't help my tears as we parted. So they were clearly appreciated. So they moved back to Bath. The house they moved to no longer exists. But the Moorlands Junior School is built on the site of where they lived. And there is one thing that was really particularly significant in their move to Bath. Now here is a picture of a couple of fashionable young ladies, probably from slightly earlier. And I want you to look at the way the horses are holding their heads. They've got those lovely proud arched necks that look just like the horses on Greek vases. This is because they were harnessed with something called the bearing rein. This was an extra piece of harness that made the horse tuck its chin in and arch its neck and look very fine. And Bath at this time was still a very fashionable town, and horses were routinely harnessed with the bearing rein. Now, the only trouble about the bearing rein is that the horse couldn't stretch his neck. And if you think of a horse going uphill, he wants to stretch his neck. And coming downhill, he wants to stretch his neck. And if the horse is pulling a heavy load, he wants to stretch his neck even more. He's got to breathe really deeply, and the bearing rein prevented the horse from doing that. It prevented the horse from breathing properly, especially when it was exerting itself, and it would cut the horse's mouth. The American publisher who really made Black Beauty an international bestseller had encountered a horse with a 2-inch cut in its mouth from this piece of harness. And there is a whole section in Black Beauty which really indicts the fashion for making a horse look fancy by harnessing it with the bearing rein. This little tin notice is actually early 20th century and from London. And the legislation was passed shortly after Black Beauty was published, which could be used to outlaw the bearing rein. It did not actually say the bearing rein cannot be used, but locally, if magistrates wanted to apply it that way, it could be used to outlaw the bearing rein. And the bearing rein now is never used in England unless with particularly irresponsible dressage riders. Unfortunately, it's called the check rein in America, and it is still in use in some places in America, and it is still in use in some places in mainland Europe. But in England, it was really abolished by Black Beauty. And of course, in Bath, she would have seen the damage that rein did because of the hills, which is so good for all our cardiovascular health. But if you were a horse, particularly if you were pulling a heavy load, can you imagine? Bath was not a good place to be. And she would also have seen plenty of cab horses. Now, when Anna lived in London, she actually lived for a short time opposite a cab stand, where the horses would be waiting for business. But she was too young, really, to have remembered that. But in a town like Bath, which was busy, it was full of business people, it was full of people who did not have the ability to keep their own carriages and were therefore hiring cabs, she saw cabs a lot. And if you ever say to anyone, I'm writing about Black Beauty, people always say, people frequently say, I did love that book. And then they say, poor Ginger. Because Ginger was Beauty's stablemate. They both were brought so low that they became common cab horses. They were both worked really hard, and Ginger was worked to death. It's all very beautifully done. Ginger dies off stage, but still brings a tear to the eye. Anna was, in close contact with cab horses every day, particularly since, the days of them keeping their own pony and trap were over, so she needed to take cabs or she couldn't go anywhere. She didn't do any real teaching while she was in Bath. And then her brother was a brilliant man. When they were living in Brighton, he fell in love with railways, and it was the right passion at the right time. He became a railway engineer. He was taught by the greatest British railway engineers, and he worked for a long time building railways in southern France and northern Spain and the Basque Country, which is quite a challenge if you think about it. Very, very steep, mountainous country. He did extremely well. He made a lot of money. He had a lot of railway shares, which were shared around the family. And then he decided to come home to resettle in Norfolk, to eventually take over his great uncle's farm, to become a bank manager in what became Barclays Bank. He had 7 children of his own and 7 who he had adopted. Meanwhile, Anna's father, bless him, had failed to notice that one of his clerks had his hand in the till. So unfortunately, Anna's father's banking career ended resoundingly and not particularly gloriously, and the whole family moved back to Old Catton, which was a village just outside Norwich. They lived quite close to each other, and Anna took on the care and education of the 14 children. But she hadn't been there very long when she fell ill, and this time there was definitely, it was different to the kind of illness she had experienced before. And although, again, it's not possible to know exactly what she was suffering from, it does appear to have been stomach cancer. And the doctor said, I actually think she is going to die in 18 months. She actually hung on 6 years. And in those 6 years, she wrote Black Beauty. And she was housebound. There's a quotation here. I have been confined to the house and to my sofa. And even there, she could go to the window and stop cabmen passing the house and ask them questions, because she wanted to get that part of the book absolutely right. She got weaker and weaker. She dictated the book to her mother, or she wrote tiny slips of paper that her mother transcribed. So as with Mary's books, so with Black Beauty, we can't say really whether they were genuinely single author books or collaborations. And eventually her mother took Black Beauty to her own publisher, Gerald's, and said, my daughter has written this little book. Now, by this time, Mary was one of their top authors. So, of course, they said, oh, we'd love to publish your daughter's little book. So they published it, and they paid £25 for it. Complete, all rights. Yes. And about, I think the book was published in November, and Anna died the following April. The book was incredibly well received in the network of animal welfare activists that they had built up by correspondence. But it wasn't until she died that her mother went back to her publishers and said, look here, you have to try harder. And the RSPCA sponsored some editions of it. And then the book finally became a massive international bestseller when the co-director or co-founder of the Massachusetts Association for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, who was an absolutely extraordinary and visionary American lawyer. He had been looking, he said, for a book that would do for animal welfare what Uncle Tom's Cabin had done for abolitionism. And somebody sent him a copy of Black Beauty from England, and he said, this is it, I've found it. And he brought enormous flair and dynamism to not only publishing the book, but promoting it through his own network of animal welfare activists right around the world. And that was when it really took off. So a happy ending. And that's really the end of the story. Now, I can't see a time on here. Do we have any questions?
Thank you, Celia. That was a fantastic and vivid rendering of that particular period, such an important period in Anna Sewell's life. We have time for questions here. I will be back and forth just checking the chat, but who wants to go first? Dipali and then Nick. So.
Thank you. Fascinating, because when I was growing up, Black Beauty made a huge impression on me, actually, because of the emotional nature of the book. I mean, Black Beauty was like a person, human being. But my question actually relates to Bath, because although they lived in Wick, and Anne was sort of not well most of her life, I don't imagine she would have done much walking and traveling. So where would she have seen all these, the horses sort of being maltreated and, being used for dragging Bathstone all over the place?
Well, I don't think you could miss it. I mean, honestly, every single thing that is done by car or vehicle nowadays was done by horse. You only had to look out of the window, as indeed she did when she was in her last days. You only had to look out of the window to see this happening. And don't forget, she rode. She could ride. So we know that it must have been her right leg that was injured, because if you ride side saddle, you don't use your right leg. Your left leg is used to give the horse aids, but your right is clamped to the saddle. So she rode herself, and she would have passed. I mean, all the coal that was mined in Wick was put on carts and taken down to Keynsham. That was a lot of coal and a lot of carts. She couldn't possibly have missed what was going on. I mean, the difference really was that she cared. She cared, and she thought she could make a difference.
Yeah.
Because everybody else accepted this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. One of the first books I had as a child was Black Beauty, a children's version of it. Mm-hmm. I can picture the cover, but I can't remember the contents at all. So a rereading is definitely in order. My question was, did the family get royalties from the book? Was that ever addressed?
No.
Oh.
No. I think, now Ian probably knows this, I think this complete buyout of all rights, as it would now be called, was actually offered to Charlotte Bronte for one of her books too. I think she had the wisdom to turn it down, but because Mary really didn't think this book was actually going to be a big seller, and that probably a small edition for the boys at the Red House Reform School who were being trained to be grooms and carters and so on, she didn't see that it would be any more than a very small printing. And so she advised Anna to accept the £25. Later on, when it was internationally published, the revenue went to the Massachusetts Association for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. But Anna herself and her family made £25.
Thanks. I've got a quick one. I can remember a really vivid part of the book where there was a big debate about Sunday working.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
I mean, I read this so long ago, and yet it's so vivid. And now that must come from the Quaker background.
Absolutely. And in fact, when her brother was... her brother's first assignment when he got to Spain was to rescue the building of a railway from, I think, Bilbao to Navarre, which an earlier engineer hadn't been able to make headway with. And he was very, very proud not only of completing the project and completing it on time, but also completing it without Sunday working. But it shows you that working men were expected to work 7 days a week, and often 10 hours a day. Yes, the horses, just as with a black cab, sometimes the cab driver owns the cab, but other times he's renting the cab from another driver. And the horse-drawn cab and the horse could be rented to a driver, and they would rent them either on a 6-day-a-week license or a 7-day-a-week license. So some of those cab horses worked every single day.
You mentioned that Anna Sewell got £25 and all the rights were sold and everything.
Yes.
Was that because she was a woman? I mean, were publishing contracts different from men, or was there any kind of sexual element or gender?
That's an interesting question, and I would say yes. Yes, I mean, Mary's first publisher was actually a partner in the company that published the Brontes. So they were well used to women writers. And in fact, one of the things I discovered when I was researching this book was that, I mean, we are so used to this piteous story of how the Bronte sisters had to adopt male names in order to be published. That's a bit of an oversimplification. They adopted male names because they wanted to write, first of all, slightly risque books by the standards of the day, but also books that they had literary ambition. And literary ambition for women was definitely frowned upon. So they chose the male name in order to be able to write literary novels. But if you didn't want to write a literary novel, if you were a vicar's wife who had been accompanied her husband to the South Seas as a missionary for 2 years and wanted to write a memoir about that, absolutely no problem. As far as I could see, every vicar's wife in England was a published author. It was very, very common for women to write acceptable books. And Mary's books, because they were simple, they were intended for people who were barely literate or for children, they were perfectly acceptable. No problem at all. Didn't have to change her name or anything. Sold 1 million copies. Deeply, and you know, although Mary's first books were very flowery, shall we say, some of her later books were really hard-hitting. I mean, she wrote a book while they were living at Wick about a young woman who was seduced and got pregnant as a teenager, and whose life spiraled into deeper and deeper tragedy after that. Clearly based on something she had seen happening locally. She did, yes. I mean, you know, it is not unknown for the publishing industry to make a bad decision in this respect. Shall we just remember that somebody offered J.K. Rowling £500 for the foreign rights to Harry Potter?
Thank you. I'm interested, you mentioned toward the end that they had a network correspondence with other activists.
Yes.
If I may ask 2 questions. One, do we know about these other activists? Were a lot of them women? And 2, what did being an activist for animal rights even look like during this period? Were there events, lectures? Did they write letters? Did they also pen other novels?
I don't know about other novels. Some of them were men, some of them were women, and there were the treatment of them by the rest of the movement varied quite significantly. So the RSPCA commissioned a military veterinarian to write a manual of horse mastership. Which began with an introduction that you could practically hear him saying, you men just are lazy and you're not treating your animals properly. This book was, they expected cab drivers in London to come to evening talks given by this guy when he was just going to, abuse them and berate them. And then they were going, and these talks would be staged in the Mayfair area. and the cab drivers lived in Hackney, which is quite a long way away, and they would have to take their really tired horses home afterwards, after all this. Unsurprisingly, this didn't work very well. Once Black Beauty happened, I mean, there were a lot of public readings. There were also there were at least two prominent women. There was a woman who wrote a little book of sort of short stories about animals, which predated Black Beauty. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the name. But that book was very influential. Her American publisher ran a magazine in which he collected masses of stories about animals and about animal welfare, some of which were really feel-good and, you know, fluffy kittens and all that kind of stuff, but some of them were quite hard-hitting. And he distributed that magazine free right through the east coast of America, and it was very much picked up by local newspapers who would simply get, I think it's called Our Dumb Friends. They would get this little newsletter coming in, and they would basically plagiarize it and put the stories in their own newspapers. There were at least two women who started working with the RSPCA, and the RSPCA was a regrettably sexist organization at that time, and they just got marginalized, and they went off and founded their own enterprises. One of them was an anti-vivisectionist, and the other one had the great good fortune that her son was a publisher, so she could get her work published through him. So there was a huge kind of landscape of different ways in which people who cared about animals were trying to make things better. And somebody who we should not forget in this was Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria became a patron of the RSPCA before she became a queen. And she was a great supporter of animal welfare throughout her life. She would, for example, not give her patronage to a medical school that used vivisection as a teaching aid. Vivisection, you understand, is the live dissection of animals. We don't want to go there, it's too horrible to think about. But she wouldn't have anything to do with it. She didn't like anybody hunting. You know, your average TV period drama has people hunting. In the time of Queen Victoria, both she and Albert hated fox hunting. Albert went out once because people were calling him a coward. He rode very well, jumped all the 5-barred gates, got off the horses and said, "I'm never doing that again." And she also, well, obviously she was a patron of Landseer, and Landseer's paintings, which are anthropomorphic in their way, in that they attribute human qualities to the monarch of the Glen or to the cute dogs in Dignity and Impudence. Anna had copied them when she was painting, because she was a good painter and enjoyed it, even though the Quakers didn't approve of painting either. Landseer's work, because his brother was an engraver, was also enormously popular, and a Landseer print was kind of a cliche in a middle-class home at that time. So the message was being spread in all kinds of different ways and all kinds of different media.
I think we're going to wrap up with a comment from one of the participants on Zoom, who, and this is definitely not by design, but is a lecturer of law at Bath University, and she just wanted to say that the exploration, the way the paper is, the talk has explored the intersection between law, literature, and conscious raising, consciousness raising and advocacy work for legal reform through literature has been absolutely fascinating. And I think that in some ways summarises some of the real strengths of this talk and why it's been so stimulating and interesting. So can you all join me in thanking Celia for a wonderful talk? Thank you.